Good morning, Mr. Hunt.
Good morning.
Now, let me explain the arrangements to you before Mary asks you to take the oath. You're talking to the audience here immediately in front of you, which consists of members of the public, co-participants and participants, and beyond this room to those who may be in the lounge or outbreak room. But beyond this building, you'll be talking to a larger audience who will be watching on YouTube or Zoom, the live stream, and that'll number in 3 figures. There are lawyers to the left of you. There'll be representatives of the press at the back on the left-hand side. So that's the setup. We'll take a break round about 11:15, maybe a little bit later, because I'm sorry that we're just a shade late in starting this morning because of various document issues. But now, Mary, perhaps you'd invite Mr. Hunt to take the oath.
Please state your full name.
Jeremy Richard Strensham Hunt.
Take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Mr. Hunt, we'll start with an overview of your political career. You've been an MP since 2005, is that correct?
Correct, yes.
In 2010, you were appointed as Secretary of State for Culture, Olympics, Media and Sport. Is that right?
Correct.
That was your first ministerial post, although you'd had shadow roles in opposition.
That's correct.
So would it follow from that you had no experience as a junior minister before being appointed directly to the Cabinet?
Correct.
6th of September 2012, you became Secretary of State for Health. That title changed in January 2018 to Secretary of State for Health and Social Care.
Correct.
And you remained in that role until the 9th of July 2018.
Correct.
And I think you have the accolade of being the longest-serving health secretary in British political history.
If that's the right word.
Yes. I think you beat Lord Fowler by about 30 days or so. You became Foreign Secretary then, and you remained in that position for approximately a year.
Correct.
And you resigned following Mr. Johnson becoming Prime Minister.
Correct.
You've remained as an MP, and you remain an MP to this day.
Correct.
You founded a charity called Patient Safety Watch in October 2019.
Yes.
And I'll ask you a little bit about that at a later stage. And then in January 2020, you were elected as chair of the House of Commons Health and Social Care Select Committee.
Yes.
I'll ask you at a later stage of your evidence about a particular report produced by that committee. But at this stage, could you just outline what the role of the Health and Social Care Select Committee is?
Yes, I mean, our job is to hold the government to account through a cross-party group of MPs. So we are licensed to be critical of the government, but in a non-partisan way, and we try and consider what the biggest issues are facing the health and social care system and produce balanced reports on what's going on, as we've done, in fact, this week on the NHS workforce issues.
Now, I want to ask you a little in general terms about the Department of Health, your role there, the role of junior ministers and so on. Is it right to understand that you were appointed in a reshuffle replacing Andrew Lansley?
Correct.
We've heard from some other ministers that when they have come into post following a reshuffle as opposed to coming in following a general election, there is less of a process of formal briefing and it can be a more ad hoc process. Was that your impression?
Yes, I mean, you've got decisions to make immediately, so you don't have the time, the luxury really of being in opposition when you can spend a long time reading into topics and working out what the big things are that you would like to change. So it is a baptism of fire, that's correct.
In terms of the junior ministers in the department during your time as Secretary of State, you've listed them in your statement. So if we just put that up on screen, please, Lawrence, it's WITN 3499001, page 11. So we can see a whole list of ministers there set out. Minister of State Norman Lamb, Anna Soubry, and then a range of other names. I'm not going to read them all out. If we go over the page, again, we can see a range of names, including, I think, the penultimate Minister of State, who is now Secretary of State. In terms of responsibility for blood and blood products, is it right to understand that that was the responsibility, first of all, of Anna Soubry?
Correct.
And that was until October 2013. Then Jane Ellison until July 2016.
Correct.
Then Lord Pryor for about 6 months until December 2016.
I believe so.
Then Lord O'Shaughnessy until June 2017. And then Jackie Doyle-Price until July 2019.
I believe so.
So the responsibility for blood products and issues relating to that, which included responsibility for the financial support schemes, always rested at parliamentary Under-Secretary of State level rather than Minister of State level.
Correct.
Could we just look at a document that you've referred to in your statement, just to get an understanding of the kind of range of responsibilities ministers might have? It's DHSC 5221811. And if we go to the second page, this is obviously the position as at 2012, I think, when you came into the department, and then obviously the names of the individuals and junior ministers would have changed over time. But we can see there, in relation to your own role, it's described as overall financial control, oversight of NHS delivery and performance and implementation of reform, relationship with NHS Commissioning Board, that's NHS England as it's otherwise known, I think, and monitor, and then delivery areas, older people, mortality, nursing, long-term conditions, other issues as required. And I'll come back to that idea of other issues as required. So that's broadly the areas that you were directly responsible for, is that right?
Yes. I would probably say that because I think this looks to me like the very first cut of responsibilities when I arrived at the department. And so overall financial control obviously was my responsibility. Oversight of NHS delivery and performance, that was because I was the person that would go to Parliament to be accountable for things like A&E and waiting times. And then the relationship with the NHS Commissioning Board, which became NHS England. The delivery areas, that changed as I got into the brief, and increasingly that really became a focus on patient safety, which was my main area where I was trying to make a difference.
And then we can see the different areas of responsibility held by the Minister of State and then the three parliamentary Under-Secretaries of State listed. And if we just look at the column relating to Anna Soubry, whose post was Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Public Health, we can see there again a range of different areas of responsibility. It includes health protection, and then we can see about halfway down that long list, blood and transplants, NHS blood and transplant. So that explains how it was that she held the brief for the issues with which this inquiry is essentially concerned.
Correct.
And then in terms of that allocation of responsibilities, do you recall how that was determined? Was that something that you decided? Was it something you inherited? How was it worked out?
Well, when you arrive as Health Secretary, and in my case with really no understanding of health policy at all, apart from having been an NHS patient, so it was quite an overwhelming moment when I first arrived. One of the first things the department wants to know is which papers to give to which of your junior ministers so that they can get decisions made on on the issues that can be decided by junior ministers. So pretty early on, I mean, I would say within the first few days, a bit of paper like this is presented to you as Secretary of State, and the officials say, this is how we are proposing to divide up the roles between your junior ministers. Are you happy with that? And I would say yes, because I didn't particularly have a different answer to give. And that would then be shown to the ministers. And then occasionally there would be some horse trading between ministers who would look at their list and say, actually, I really want to have responsibility for this one, and I think someone else should have responsibility for that one. And then it would come back to me. But it was a pretty key objective, I would say, for the first week to do that. And then that would go to number 10, who would then look at it and generally approve whatever decision we'd all come to.
And then would it follow that as you settled into the role as Secretary of State for Health, you could change the allocation of responsibilities if you thought it appropriate for any particular reason?
You could. It was a pretty unusual thing to do. I'm trying to think whether it ever happened, actually, in my nearly 6 years where responsibilities were changed. But I don't think theoretically it was impossible.
We can take that down, thank you. Now, we saw from the list in your statement that there was quite a turnover of junior ministers at the Department of Health, even though you were, as I alluded to earlier, there for quite a significant period of time. We've seen that as perhaps as something of a pattern in the earlier decades that the inquiry has been looking at, a fairly frequent turnover, in particular of junior ministers. Was there any particular reason for that? Was the Department of Health different from other departments, or is that just how government is run?
Unfortunately, it's how government is run, and it shouldn't be. And the first thing to say is that as a Secretary of State, you don't really have any control over who your ministers are. That's decided by number 10 in consultation with the Chief Whip. So you're basically told, you're appointed to Secretary of State, and you're told these are your ministers. And then when there's a reshuffle, if you've been around a while, you might be able to put in a word and say, I'm very keen to keep X. You know, and I did that. I mean, Norman Lamb was an excellent minister, and I was always very happy to work with him, for example. But it wasn't your decision, and unfortunately there was a lot of turnover, and I think that government is the poorer for it. Where you have a minister who stays for a very long time, for example, Nick Gibb stayed as Minister for School Standards for a very long time. He was able to make a real difference even though he wasn't a Secretary of State, so I think it's something that we don't get right.
Now, you've said in your statement, and again it's reflective of what those who held the role before you have told the inquiry, that in terms of detailed consideration of issues that fell within the responsibility of a junior minister, the Secretary of State would not have the same degree of knowledge or a continuous oversight of the junior minister's work. Is that right?
Correct. I mean, would you like me to explain what
Yes.
my approach to
Please.
that was? Could we just put up that slide we
Absolutely.
had before showing all the different responsibilities that,
Yes.
that the different ministers had?
So it's DHSC 5221811. Again, please, Lawrence, page 2.
So I arrived without any understanding really of health policy. I campaigned on constituency health issues as a Member of Parliament, and I had no expectation that I was going to become Secretary of State for Health. And I come from a business background, and I decided very early on that the only way to approach such a difficult job, you know, the world's 5th largest employer, 1.4 million people you're responsible for, is to decide on a few areas where you're going to make a difference and really be very disciplined about delegating everything else to junior ministers. And so I wasn't a Secretary of State who insisted on all big decisions coming back up to me. I was very happy for my junior ministers to make those decisions because I wanted to clear my bandwidth for making big changes. And in the end, which is of course directly relevant to this inquiry, I decided that my main focus was going to be on the reduction of avoidable harm and death in modern healthcare systems, which I decided was a massive blind spot that people And that really didn't come to me when this table in front of you was written. It came to me a few months later when I was having to respond to the Francis inquiry into what happened at Mid-Staffs. And I decided that would be my main thing. But if you look at that table, that would give you the impression that there's a lot of decisions that have to be taken, and that is true. But that is actually only a small part of what you have to do as a minister. The other thing you have to do is to go to Parliament as Health Secretary often every week, because there's a crisis, there's an urgent question in Parliament, there's a statement that has to be delivered, the Prime Minister's having to answer questions on the NHS at Prime Minister's Questions, which very often happened. And so there's the political side to essentially media and parliamentary handling. And then you have to get out and about and visit people. So curious though it might sound, the big priority areas that I wanted to focus my attention on, I discovered the only way that I could actually properly have time for those areas was to do all those meetings on a Monday before 3:30, because 3:30 was the first moment you could be hauled into Parliament for an urgent question. So that's why I found that it became not just advisable but essential to delegate responsibilities for as many areas as you could to your junior ministers.
Some of those, again, who've held the role before you have told the inquiry that they would have regular meetings with junior ministers. Was that a process that you followed?
Yes, we would meet every week, and people would raise issues in their portfolio that were a concern. And then, of course, the door was always open if they wanted to come and talk in more detail about specific issues.
And then we've also heard that some Secretaries of State had what I think has been described as top of the office meetings, so regular meetings with permanent secretary or officials at that level of seniority. Was that something that you followed?
I don't think I had a regular meeting, as in a weekly slot with my permanent secretary, but I mean, I had two permanent secretaries, both excellent, but I think I saw them for those meetings on a Monday. They usually attended most of those with me, so I had a lot of contact with my permanent secretary.
So we can take that down, Lawrence, thank you. In relation to the Chief Medical Officer, what was the extent and frequency of your interaction with the CMO?
It wasn't quite so structured. It tended to be when there was a public health issue, such as Ebola, for example. I then had a lot of meetings and worked very closely with Sally Davis, who was Chief Medical Officer at that time. But there wasn't a structured, formal way for interacting with the Chief Medical Officer.
Now, if as Secretary of State you are, for the reasons you've explained, reliant upon your junior ministers to be on top of the areas that they're responsible for, and those junior ministers are changing frequently, they are presumably going to be very heavily reliant on the briefings and submissions they receive from civil servants.
That is correct. And some junior ministers would challenge those briefings and would come to me and say, my officials are briefing X, Y, and Z, I think it's nonsense and we should do A, B, and C. Others would be more accepting. But yes, indeed, I was dependent on the briefings I was getting from ministers as well, from officials as well, on a whole range of issues that did come to my desk. I don't think the system could function without that.
And so to what extent is the real influence on policy and whether policies stay for long periods of time in situ or whether they're changed, largely held and retained by the officials who remain in post over a much longer period of time than ministers?
I think that depends on the extent to which ministers choose to get involved in a policy area. And so if you decide as a minister that you think X needs to be done, officials are very respectful of the fact that constitutionally you are the decision maker, not them. So I didn't come across the sort of Sir Humphrey-like parody where officials were scheming behind my back to try and get a particular outcome to happen against my wishes. I thought they were very respectful of what ministers wanted to do. But if a minister didn't have a particular interest in an area or didn't get stuck into the detail enough of an area, then I think the status quo would prevail, and there was quite a lot of institutional inertia around established positions, such as the fact when I arrived, and I was very struck by the fact that there was a sense that we should not go public with any mistakes the NHS had made, because that would be bad for the reputation of the institution and would shake public confidence in the NHS. So there was a received wisdom in those areas.
And that particular issue is an issue I want to come back to at a later stage. And then in terms of matters that were within the responsibilities of junior ministers but might come to you from time to time, were there any particular triggers that might mean something came to you? Questions in Parliament or media interest or significant amounts of expenditure?
Well, I had the right to take over any issues that I wanted to, and that was kind of understood because I was the boss in the department. Officials would flag to me if they thought that a minister wanted to do things that was against broader government policy or that the Treasury wouldn't accept. And so as I was responsible ultimately for relations between the department and number 10 and number 11, sometimes an issue would rise for that reason. But most of the time, it was just simply the choice of the junior minister. They would basically decide if they wanted to raise an issue with me, ask my advice on something, discuss it with me. And if they didn't, and it was something that needed my formal sign-off, then a submission, as they were called in the civil service, a recommendation on paper would come up to me, and it would say, the junior minister wants to do A, B, and C. Are you content? And 99 times out of 100, I would say yes.
And then to what extent did you, as Secretary of State for Health, have direct interaction with patients or campaigning organisations? I'm not here talking specifically about interactions with those whose interests lie at the heart of this inquiry. We'll come on to that. But in general terms.
Well, I think I mentioned in a book I published earlier this year that 5 months into the job, I went to Margaret Thatcher's funeral, and in the eulogy by the Bishop of London, he talked about a letter that she had written, I think, to an 11-year-old boy. And I sat there and I thought, I don't think I've seen a single letter from a patient or a member of the public in the 5 months I've been Health Secretary. And if she can do that as Prime Minister, I certainly can as Health Secretary. And I went back and I inquired, and I was told there was an army of 150 officials whose job it was to respond to letters from the public, and in some ways to shield ministers from those letters. And I thought that was wrong, and I said that I would like to see at least one letter every day from a member of the public, and I'd like it to be waiting for me on my desk, and I would reply personally to that letter. I asked for that to happen, and nothing happened, and I discovered later that there'd been meetings behind the scenes. Perhaps they were a bit Sir Humphrey-like, wondering how they could dissuade the Secretary of State from this thoroughly bad idea. But when I chased it, a letter did come, and it said, I'm just writing to thank you, Secretary of State, for the brilliant care I've had from the NHS. And I said, no, that's not the kind of letter I want. And eventually, I did start getting these letters, and I set aside the first 20 minutes, half an hour of every day to handwrite a reply to those letters. And that was probably the biggest single thing that made me appreciate that there is a massive institutional reluctance in the NHS to listen to the stories of ordinary people when things have gone wrong. And there is a a view which I think is changing, in all credit to the NHS, but there was certainly a very strong view that harm to patients is part of the cost of doing business. It's part of what happens. I discovered, by the way, this was not just the case in the NHS, but in healthcare systems all around the world. I was told that 10% of patients in healthcare systems are harmed. I then asked how many people die, and I was told that 4% of hospital deaths have a 50% or more chance of being preventable, which works out at about 150 deaths a week. And I thought that was outrageous. Everyone was kind of accepting that. This is not someone dying because a cure to their disease has not been found. This is someone dying because of medical error. A mistake has been made in their care. And so I decided that was something that we needed to change the culture about. And I discovered that there was an army of ethical doctors and nurses who were as troubled as I was about this completely wrong sense that harm is inevitable. And so I was actually pushing it an open door. It wasn't one man against the system. There were lots of people inside the system who were very, very troubled by the approach that was taken to avoidable harm and death.
And without going to any of the specific interactions that you describe in your book, it would seem from a number of the encounters that you describe in your book that direct engagement with people who have been harmed or whose loved ones have been harmed is something that is very important for politicians to have, obviously within the limits of what is proportionate and reasonable, bearing in mind all the other demands upon a politician's time. But would you say it's an essential part of the business of the Secretary of State for Health?
I think it's the thing that you can do because, when you're Health Secretary, you're not a doctor, you're not an expert, you're surrounded by people who are, but you are elected. So you do go and knock on doors and meet people at election time. So I think what you bring to the table is the meetings you have with patients who use the NHS. And, I remember probably one of the first meetings I had was with a couple from Devon whose 3-year-old son died from sepsis. And they said that when they tried to challenge what happened, the shutters came down, the local hospital refused to meet them. It was like speaking to a brick wall. And I realised that there was a very defensive culture inside the NHS. And my first instinct was that, this is outrageous and the people who are doing this, are responsible for this, should be disciplined or even fired if they're not listening to patients. I then discovered that they were also often terrified that if they were open about mistakes that would be made, they themselves would get fired or not be allowed to practice anymore, be struck off the register or whatever. And so there's a blame culture inside the NHS which creates a defensiveness to the people who use the NHS. And the tragedy of this, the real tragedy, is that you then don't learn from mistakes and that the same mistakes get repeated over and over again.
And I just want to pick up on your description of what you referred to a few minutes ago of wanting to see letters and adopting that practice in your book. Lawrence, could we have RLIT 301163? You describe there, as you've told us, listening to the eulogy delivered at Mrs Thatcher's funeral and the letter that she'd received and your awareness, bottom of the page, that you hadn't received in any letters from NHS patients. If we could go over the page. I'm picking it up halfway down that page. You describe the first letter arriving, thanking you for the fantastic NHS care, and you saying, no, you want to know what's going wrong. And then you say this, and I just want to read out the next 3 or 4 paragraphs. Eventually, I did start getting some proper complaint letters. They were eye-opening and sometimes horrifying. It didn't matter what form they came in, sometimes an email, sometimes shaky handwriting from an older person, sometimes on scraps of notepaper with terrible spelling. The cry for help was clear. Stories about young children lodged particularly in my mind as a father of 3. One of the earlier letters hit me especially hard. It was from a man in Cumbria writing about his teenage daughter who'd killed herself the day after an appointment with a mental health nurse. In the very first letter I replied to, I apologised for the terrible care someone had received. The next day, my letter came back with a note from officials saying, "Apologies not permitted." Presumably, someone was worried about a legal admission of liability. However, I knew that the law is perfectly sensible in this respect, and apologies do not count as an admission of guilt. The letter went out unchanged. And then you describe the daily routine that you've told us about. So it would seem from this that you encountered a degree of resistance from officials, both to being provided with letters criticising NHS care in the first place, and then to a response that included apologies or acknowledgement of fault. Is that right?
Yes, I think I think it's changing actually, but I think there was a very strong institutional nervousness about focusing too much on the mistakes that were made in the NHS. And there were various reasons for this, but I think that there was a sense that there were these awful things, that doctors were doing their job, and we shouldn't crucify someone who made a mistake because they were doing their best, and that the NHS was an overwhelming force for good in society, and that was the important thing to remember. But I felt this was the tragedy of this, and I came to look at some of the facts and figures. The tragedy of it is that very often these are mistakes that you could actually prevent happening again by changing procedures and structures. And so the problem with this cover-up culture, I mean, we talked about mid-staffs, for example. The most shocking thing, in my judgment, about mid-staffs was not that it happened, because bad things happen in any large system. It was that it happened, and it took 4 years between 2005 and 2009 before it was stopped. And I think it would be wrong to say that in those 4 years nothing happened. I think what happened was that people in the NHS thought, okay, we've got a problem in mid-staffs, things aren't going terribly well, let's see if we can have a quiet word with the chief executive and ask him to sort it out quietly, and let's see if we can resolve it by this way. And then someone would go along and have a look and say, well, I had a meeting with the chief executive and he's going to do his very best, and I think we should give him 6 months to try and turn things around. Those kinds of conversations were happening behind closed doors because everyone thought the best thing to do was to try and sort it out quietly without anyone finding out. The result was the most horrific care essentially carried on for 4 years. And so that's why I concluded that transparency is one of the most important weapons, openness, but it has to be that transparency that does not immediately come with a blame culture. Because in fact, if you start blaming and punishing people the moment you're open about a mistake, then you kill the transparency stone dead. And so I looked at other industries, particularly the airline industry, that has managed to get that cultural change. And I tried to do as much as I can to get the NHS to adopt that no blame culture.
Just a couple of other, we can take that down, thank you, general questions before we turn to look at decision making in relation to infected blood and blood products. In terms of interactions with Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland on matters relating to health, now by the time you were Secretary of State, these were areas that were devolved to those administrations, but to what extent was there any form of interaction, at least at ministerial level, with your counterparts in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland?
There was some, but in truth, we tried to make as much of that communication happen through official levels, because Scotland, Wales and England were all run by different political parties, and the NHS was often a huge political football between the different parties. And so it was, you know, if I was being accused by Labour of running the NHS badly in England, I would naturally reply, well, it's doing even worse in Wales on things like A&E and waiting times figures. And in that context, it was never going to be very easy to have a particularly constructive relationship. I think we did have constructive relationships when there were public health emergencies, you know, things like Ebola, and I suspect COVID, although that was not when I was around. But, and I think you can see in the files, there were some letters that I wrote on various occasions to my counterparts in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. But it was never particularly easy because of the political context.
And then I wanted to ask you next, again in general terms at this stage, about interactions with the Treasury. Again, it's an issue we've explored with a number of your predecessors. You've described in your statement, in section 3 of your statement, some of the particular issues relating to the state of the department's finances during the time that you were Secretary of State for Health. But could you first assist us by understanding how the relationship with the Treasury worked?
Yes, I think the relationship with the Treasury changed, it deteriorated during my time as Health Secretary. When I arrived as Health Secretary in 2012, the Department of Health was considered to have been given special treatment by the Treasury because in the Department of Culture, where I was before, for example, my budget was cut by 24% in 2010. So I had to implement huge cuts across the arts, sports, technology, all the areas that I was responsible for. And that was the first time cuts of that nature had ever happened in peacetime. And that was a hugely difficult exercise. And most other government departments were going through that. The NHS was exempted from that. They were given a 0.1% real terms rise, but it was basically a freezing of the NHS budget. And although it seems strange to laud that now, at the time there was a feeling that the NHS had actually done very well out of the spending review not to have had the cut that everyone else had. Of course, it was an effective cut because demand for NHS services was going up by between 3 and 4% a year because of increasing numbers of older people and new discoveries, new medicines and so on. So the NHS was actually having to find, when I arrived as Health Secretary, £20 billion worth of savings. It was called the Nicholson Challenge, named after Sir David Nicholson, who was Chief Executive of the NHS. So there was a huge programme to find efficiencies in the NHS budget. But generally, I think the feeling was that we had been spared a cut. The way the system works in Whitehall is that any big spending decision requires Treasury approval. And if there's a disagreement with the Treasury, you can go to the Prime Minister. But George Osborne and David Cameron had a very close relationship. So effectively, we always knew that number 10 and number 11 would be singing from the same hymn sheet. So if it was something that needed more money than was in our departmental budget, then you would obviously have to go to the Treasury. But we had a pretty good idea the answer would be no, given the overall state of public finances. If it was something within your budget, you generally didn't have to go to the Treasury unless it was a very large sum of money. If it was something like a pay award for nurses, something like that, that was going to have, you know, cost hundreds of millions of pounds, then the Treasury would want to have a say.
And if we can go back to your book again, and just see your description there of the relationships with the Treasury, RLIT 0001163, again, please, Lawrence, page 16. And I want to pick it up in the bottom paragraph of this page, where you say this: you might imagine, given that health and social care represents more than 40% of day-to-day government spending, that there would be a rigorous logical process to get to the bottom of such issues, and you refer above to certain funding issues in that regard, and calculate the exact amount needed. But I found the opposite to be the case. Indeed, the process through which a health secretary secures extra funding is surprisingly haphazard. Because of its central importance to safe care for patients, let's take a moment to look at how that happens in the UK. And then the top of the next page, you say the starting point is that the Department of Health is always viewed by the Treasury as the most troublesome government department. Others would haggle for months over 10 million or 20 million pounds. But for the NHS, you would need to add not one but two or three noughts to those numbers. A small change in health spending, by far the largest single item if you exclude the benefits bill, has a major impact on the national accounts. Even worse from the Treasury's point of view is that, like Oliver Twist, we always came back for more. Timing was everything if you were to be successful in overcoming those deep suspicions. And there's no better moment than just before a general election. And then you go on to describe the particular process in terms of securing funding in the run-up to the 2015 election. If you wanted to secure Treasury funding for something that, so extra funding from the Treasury, what would the process be? Would you have to make out a case? And how long typically might that take?
Well, the broad rule was that only happened during spending reviews, and so you would have every 3 years or 4 years a spending review in which there would be a very long and structured process in which departments would put in their bids for extra money. In the case of the Department of Health, I arrived in the middle of a spending review, so our departmental budget was settled. But if there was going to be something that was a big additional expenditure, for example, the Ministry of Defence suddenly finds it's fighting a war, then they would go to the Treasury and say, obviously we need extra cash because of the fact that we've now got this war to fight. So that would be the system. But my situation was I concluded really quite quickly that the NHS needed more cash. In particular, I was very worried about short staffing on the wards. I thought that was one of the main reasons that we had the problems at mid-staffs, and staffing costs money. And so I did think we needed extra money. And so I used the election, which was actually outside a spending review, to make the case to George Osborne that we should offer an extra £8 billion to the NHS because of what the NHS said they needed. And he agreed it in just one meeting, even though we hadn't won the election, and the spending review was to take place 6 months later, as it happened. So you do have to be opportunistic, but the basic rule is there is no extra money outside spending reviews. And as I'm sure we're going to talk about, in the case of the contaminated blood scandal, it was made very clear to me that any funding for families and people affected by the scandal would have to come from my departmental budget.
And we'll pick up on that as we look at some of the documents. Can I turn then to the extent of your knowledge about the contaminated blood scandal? You say in your statement that this was something you were aware of before becoming a minister, following contact in 2007 with a constituent, Mike Doricott. My understanding is that you had interactions both before and after becoming Secretary of State with other constituents, Steve Nichols, Melanie Richmond, two indeed here today. So in broad terms, from those interactions with Mr. Doricott and other constituents, what was your understanding of the position?
My understanding was that a terrible injustice had been done. And I, as a backbench MP, I tried to be accessible to my constituents, and I didn't mention Melanie and Steve in my statement because the fact that Mike Doricott sadly passed away is something that stayed with me, and I think that it made a big impression on me because when he came to talk to me about this terrible scandal, I don't think either of us thought for a moment that I would end up being Health Secretary, and theoretically in a position to do something about it. And so I did, I think, arrive, and perhaps I was the first health secretary who arrived with a sense of the injustice of the situation. I don't think that it would be right for me to say that I was able to make a judgment about whether in the 1970s and 80s infected blood was deliberately supplied to haemophiliacs and other people who needed it, because that's what your inquiry is going to try and get to the bottom of. But what I could see was that the state had supplied infected blood, which had taken away the lives of many people and limited the lives of many others and ruined the lives of many, many families, and that was a terrible injustice. And so, yes, I did come with that understanding.
And then can I just pick up on some of the information that would have come to or been held by the Department of Health during your early years as Secretary of State? And as we look through documents, I'm going to try and make clear those which you would have seen and those which you would not have seen.
Okay.
Because quite a lot, I think, of what we'll look at is material that wouldn't necessarily have passed your desk when you were Secretary of State. We can pick matters up, perhaps, just with Mr. Doricott at WITN 3499003. And if we go to the second page, we can see Mike, if we look at the bottom half of the page, writing to you in October 2012, you're relatively new in the post, says, I thought I would give you a little time to get to grips with a new job before contacting you again to raise the issue of bringing closure to the contaminated blood issue. Please, can you advise what you're planning to do to resolve the outstanding issues surrounding the infection of haemophiliacs with contaminated NHS blood/blood products? Now, Mike was writing to you because you were his constituency MP. And if we see from the top of the page, you then wrote or forwarded that email on to someone within the Department of Health, I think, who's one of your principal private secretaries. You asked, we can see there, for investigation of the concern and a response to you. And then if we go to the first page, we can see it's forwarded on the top of the page. It says, please log as a PO, and that's an email from someone who's called the correspondence manager for the Secretary of State. Now, we've seen reference with other witnesses to TO, treat official, which, as I understand it, usually results in a letter coming from this correspondence unit within the department. Do you know what PO refers to?
I'm afraid not.
Don't worry. But in any event, what appears to have happened is a reply going back to Mr. Doricott, not from you, but from Anna Soubry. And just before we look at that reply, why would that have been the case?
So when I arrived as Secretary of State, there was a protocol that, to avoid a conflict of interest between your ministerial role and your role as a constituency MP, any constituency matters would be dealt with by the relevant minister who was responsible for that area. So they were following that procedure.
And if we look at Anna Soubry's response, DHSC 5080237, I'm sorry, I should say this is a response from Anna Soubry to you. I'm not quite sure what response was sent to Mr. Doricott. She says this, so she refers to the email from Mike, and then the next paragraph talks about a review of the support schemes that had taken place in autumn of 2010. And then if we go down the page, we can see in the paragraph beginning, we also recognise there's reference to the establishment of the Caxton Foundation, which had taken place by this point in time. And then she says, I appreciate that Mr. Doricott and some other campaigners are unhappy about certain aspects of the package that's now available. However, our approach has been to target resources at those who are suffering most as a result of their infection, and I think that is entirely proper. there's reference to some teething problems with the Caxton Foundation. Bottom of the page then refers to the department's expert advisory group on hepatitis, keeping clinical and scientific evidence in relation to hepatitis C under review, and a reference then, if we go over the page, to Ms Soubry meeting with campaign groups, and then the assertion, as you can see, the changes that this government has introduced have established a much more generous and comprehensive package of financial support than was available previously. Now, it might be said that isn't really an answer to what Mike was raising. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, Anna Soubry was giving him the official response, and it was the procedure that I was advised was appropriate, that she should respond, not me. But my response to that would have been, because we were both new ministers, look, Anna's on the case. She's a very thoughtful, compassionate person, and she's absolutely someone who takes the sides of patients in these issues, and I would have read that as being Anna's on the case and she's looking into it.
In terms of other information available to you in those that early period as Secretary of State, you've said you didn't receive any briefing on issues relating to infected blood. You do recall being briefed on issues requiring immediate decisions, such as matters relating to the Francis inquiry. Can I just ask you to look at a brief that I think wasn't for you, but it's at DHSC 6725752. So this is a document which sets out the role of the Public Health Directorate within the Department of Health, and we can see there is then identified 6 divisions within the Directorate that are then listed, and if we go over the page, there's then a section describing each of the divisions within the Directorate. I just want to turn to one of those, the one that deals with issues relating to infected blood and blood products. So it's page 14. So this division is health protection. If we look in the bottom half of the page, we can see it says the division's main areas of responsibility are as follows. And then there's reference to immunisation, infectious diseases, and then sponsoring NHS blood and transplant, and then references to pandemic flu and environmental hazards. And then if we go to the next page, there's a section key facts, and as I understand it, this is something that may have been received by Anna Soubry as a briefing, but again, that's an issue we can take up elsewhere. But under the heading Key Facts, there's a number then of points relevant to the division's areas of responsibility. And the second is this. NHS Blood and Transplant supplies over 2 million units of blood to hospitals in England and North Wales each year. The risk of infection from transfusion is now extremely low. During the 1970s and 80s, hepatitis C and HIV infection from contaminated NHS blood was a problem before it was possible to screen donors and make products safer. A number of funds provide support for those affected. Now, I'm conscious, Mr Hunt, you almost certainly didn't see this document when you became Secretary of State. But it would appear that the briefing that is being given to new ministers in relation to this issue, it isn't revealing any concerns about what had happened. The sentence beginning during the 1970s and 80s, saying it was a problem before it was possible to screen donors and make products safer. An inference from that might be, well, this was just an unavoidable problem.
I mean, that briefing is wrong, and it shouldn't say that. And I'm afraid it's perhaps an example of what has been described as a kind of memory illusion, but at a departmental level where the people collectively try and remember things as they would like them to have been rather than as they actually were. But I think it was a bad briefing for ministers, because at the very least ministers should be aware as politicians that this is contentious and this is disputed by families. You know, I'm afraid it tries to suggest that the issue is closed when it's not, and it shouldn't have done that.
I should identify that over the page under the heading Current Priorities and Issues, there is reference to lobbying in the context of financial support. So the third bullet point from the bottom of the page refers to lobbying for greater support for those infected with hepatitis C via contaminated blood, and reference to the meeting that we saw earlier.
But I think that doesn't give any sense of the injustice of the issue. It's just that suggests the issue is financial support for those who have an illness, rather than compensation for unfair treatment.
And then if we can turn to another document that came addressed to you, but I think quite possibly not seen by you, again, in the first few weeks of your position. It's DHSC 6762159. It's a letter from the Haemophilia Society, from Chris James, Chief Executive, to you, 15th of October 2012. Now, a number of the matters that are raised in this letter deal with issues of broader significance to the Haemophilia Society. But if we go to the penultimate paragraph on this page, it says this: I know that you will be aware from your constituent Mike Doricott of the devastating impact of contaminated NHS blood and blood products from the 1970s and 1980s, and of the recommendations of Lord Archer's independent inquiry. I would be grateful if you would read our attached policy, which gives more detail on this and on the issues outstanding. And if we go to the third page of this document, we can see the policy, Haemophilia Society Policy on Contaminated Blood, September 2012. And so I just wanted to look at it with you, but I do so in the knowledge that this was a letter responded to by Norman Lamb, and as such, as I understand it, a letter that it's highly unlikely that you saw. Is that right?
Correct.
So we can see the first paragraph under the heading Introduction refers to a large proportion of blood products being contaminated with HIV or hepatitis C viruses, and gives figures in relation to patients with haemophilia. So that would give an indication to the reader of some sense of the scale of what had happened. Is that fair?
Correct.
And of course, this is only dealing with patients with bleeding disorders, and not as the document itself makes explicit, those who were infected through transfusion. The second paragraph talks about issues relating to the 1970s and 1980s, with the assertion that a promise of self-sufficiency was never kept. So would it be fair to say that that would tell the reader that there are indeed contentious issues about whether things were done wrong or could have been done differently in earlier decades?
Yes.
And then the third paragraph talks about communication to patients and asserts the NHS made no clear communication of the known risks to patients and did not change practice to avoid use of blood products for patients who required treatment only infrequently and could have been adequately treated with safer alternatives. So that raises another issue which lies at the heart of this, what patients were told and the extent to which they were able to make informed choices. Is that fair?
Yes, I mean, this is obviously something which I have a great deal of sympathy with the allegations being made, but they are things that are being stated by a campaigning organisation, which Norman Lamb will then have been advised on how best to respond.
Absolutely. It's just really to get an understanding of what the institutional knowledge within the department would have been at this time of what was being said and what the kind of issues were, rather than anything that would have particularly been on your direct horizon. And then we can see the and then we've got the heading summary, and it says this policy comprises three main requirements: an acknowledgement by the Prime Minister, a UK-wide statutory public inquiry, and immediate interim steps to give equitable support to those affected. And then it gives further detail about that, which I don't propose to read out. So, although this wasn't a document you saw, from your interactions with Mike and others, can you recall whether you were aware that what was being sought at that time were these three matters?
I don't know whether I would have been able to, I'm sure Mike told me those are the three things that need to happen. Whether I would have remembered that 5 years on when I became Health Secretary, I doubt. I don't believe I saw this letter. And I think this is not to excuse what I'm sure was yet another response where the government refused to take action. But I think the context would be that ministers get letters from campaign groups the whole time saying that this or that needs to happen, often because of an injustice. Indeed, we received lots over the mid-staffs situation, which led to my predecessor, Andrew Lansley, setting up the public inquiry into mid-staffs. What I think is apparent from this letter and the previous briefing that you showed was given presumably to Anna Soubry as the minister responsible from that area, is that the government didn't have or the state is perhaps a more accurate phrase, including the civil service, didn't have an open mind to this issue. They basically had decided that the state in the 1970s and 80s had done the best it could in the circumstances. A very sad thing had happened. Compensation had been put in place. Matter closed. And I don't think the fact that none of that reached the briefing that would have been seen by Anna Soubry suggests exactly the kind of institutional closing of ranks, which I think would have probably happened in stages. I think immediately after it happened, people who were close to the issues might have thought, well, perhaps a mistake was made. Perhaps we shouldn't have done that. Perhaps we should have informed people. But then I think the next set of thoughts may well have been, obviously I don't know this, but I'm just speculating because I think it happened in other areas, many, many other areas. The next set of thoughts were, yes, but these were all good people trying to do their best. And, in those circumstances, we just need to recognise that it wasn't an easy decision. And then I think the next stage in thinking, which I think is the most flawed of all, but I think may well have been, I can't say if it was in this case, but was definitely present in many other areas, was, yes, we were giving it to 2,000 people and 50 of them were being infected every year, but it was the greatest good of the greatest number and we were helping 1950 people. And to me that is fundamentally against what the NHS should stand for, which is the highest standards of safety and care to every single person as if they were your own mother, father, son or daughter. But I think that you can see that thought process happening in a lot of areas where there were terrible breaches of patient safety, because it is true that no one is trying to do the wrong thing, or that, of course, there are one or two bad apples in a system as large as the NHS, but by and large, no one is trying to do the wrong thing. And then what happens is people think, well, we need to protect those people who are trying to do the right thing. And then once you get 5 years on, 10 years on, people forget that there was even a moral dilemma, and the account of history changes. So I don't think the officials who wrote that briefing to Anna Soubry would have probably had any understanding of what happened. One might hope, and that, by the way, was why Andy Burnham, who I know has given evidence, was advised not to meet the mid-staff's relatives, and something that they are angry about to this day. And I'm sure, in retrospect, he wishes that he had. But officials said, no, it's not a good use of your time, and you'll get drawn into it. It's why, by the way, in a completely different context, when I became Foreign Secretary, I was initially advised by the Foreign Office not to meet Richard Ratcliffe, the husband of Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, because there was a lot of suspicion about how he might try and use the meeting. And so I'm afraid that institutions and the state close ranks around a lie sometimes. And I think that's what's happened in this case.
And just for the sake of completeness, Mr. Lamb's response is WITN 3499004. 26th of November 2012, and we can see, I think, from the first paragraph why it was that Mr. Lamb was responding. Second sentence, I'm replying as the Minister responsible for policy on long-term conditions. So because the letter had dealt with a range of matters relating to haemophilia, not only had it not gone to you, it didn't in fact even go to Anna Soubry, as far as I think we can see from the document trail. It went to Mr. Lamb for the reason he's given there. And then if we just go to the third page, because most of the letter deals with other matters that have been raised by the Haemophilia Society in relation to the issue that we're concerned with, it's just that paragraph. Finally, I would like to thank you for sharing the current draft of the Society's contaminated blood policy. I note you intend to review it again in light of the findings of the Penrose inquiry. We'd be grateful if after doing so you could provide officials with a copy of the policy document so that any issues can be addressed. Now that's could be said that's kicking it off into the long grass to an extent.
Yes, and I think it's important to say, Norman Lamb was a different political party to me, and it was a coalition government at the time. But I have not worked with anyone who has done more to champion unpopular causes against what the establishment is saying. And he particularly did it in mental health, learning disability, those areas. And I think the fact that he wrote a reply, which I'm sure he wouldn't be happy with if he saw today, is an indication that you do depend on advice from your ministerial team when you're sending these letters out.
So I note the time, so perhaps we could take our mid-morning break now, because I'm going to come on next to a series of documents relating to financial support.
Yes. Well, we will. We'll take a break for half an hour then until 11:45. Now, this is the first break. You're giving evidence under oath. What you must not do is discuss with anyone, whoever that anyone is, anything which you have already given in evidence or anything which you think you may yet be asked to give in evidence. But you can talk about anything else you like.
Understood, Sir Brian.